Welcome on board the RichPlanet starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. On this week's show, a slight deviation from the usual subjects. There has been talk in the media of governments wanting the ability in an emergency to be able to switch off or kill internet communications. One alternative to internet communication is radio communication. And here to talk about it, I'd like to welcome on board the starship ham radio operator George Tuck. Welcome, George.
Hello, Richard.
Your other name is G4RNI.
Well, that's the call sign I have on the license here.
Right.
Yeah.
And we got here eventually because we did plan to record this show some months ago.
I've been going to do it a number of times. I'm sorry I've had to let you down time after time, but it's the illness I have. It's called fibromyalgia, and sometimes I get out of bed and I just go straight back there because I'm just too ill, but
right.
We got here.
Okay. Now, we've got a couple of sets here, George, which we're going to discuss later in the show, ham radio sets. Now, just broadly, you know, ham radio enthusiasts have this sort of a nerdy reputation. Would you? I went along to your club actually, and I fitted in quite well there.
Yeah, they're an okay bunch of lads down there.
Yeah, they are.
Lads, yeah. I think the confusion is that people, since the advent of CB radio, tend to regard the two as the same, but they're not. They're two totally different aspects of radio.
Right, right. I mean, I like to consider myself as a closet nerd. In other words, what that means is inside I'm a nerd, but I try not to outwardly show it so that people will listen to me.
Okay. Yeah, I think that people have this view of weird people sitting with smoking a pipe in a dusky little room, sort of talking to people about strange subjects and God knows what.
Yes.
I suppose some do that, yeah. But the difference really between CB and ham radio is CB is for two people to talk over a short distance, keep in touch with somebody, maybe driving a lorry, keep in touch with friends. Yeah. Anybody can buy a set, anybody can put up an aerial for it and do it. Amateur radio, or ham radio as it's more widely known, is a means by which you can self-train in radio communication. And that's the main purpose of the license, to learn about the theory and practice of radio communication.
Because there are limitations of things that you're allowed to discuss. We'll talk about that.
Yes.
Talk about that later. Now, before we go into you know, the sets and everything, just want to talk about radio waves, because there is an electromagnetic spectrum. Space allows waves to pass through it, which are called electromagnetic waves.
We have a nice little chart here, which you prepared earlier.
Well, before we go to that one, George, I've got another one here, which is the entire spectrum. That one that you've got there is the radio spectrum.
Yes.
Which this chart goes right the way through to visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. So just to point out that all of these waves, they're all actually
basically the same stuff.
They're all the same stuff. They're just operating at different frequencies.
Different wavelengths.
Different wavelengths.
People regard it, they understand wavelengths better than frequencies, I think.
Yes, yes.
Even though they don't understand wavelengths.
Yes. Well, the wavelength is inversely proportional to the frequency.
The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency.
The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency. And radio generally operates on the longer wavelengths in the visible spectrum you would consider. So you've got right the way from wavelengths which are as long as a football pitch, which would be very low frequency.
Several hundred meters,
Yeah, up to your microwave end, where
we're talking in centimeters, millimeters.
Centimeters, millimeters, and that's the radio spectrum covers all of those wavelengths. So we've got a chart here. If we home in on this chart here, we'll just put this on the screen. This is the UK frequency allocation chart, and it's, I mean, you look at it and it's quite, there's a lot of detail in there.
It looks very, very complicated.
Yeah, so that goes right from the low frequencies, 3 kilohertz, up to 300 gigahertz, and it's all split. We'll just point out some notable parts of it, George. You've got the broadcast in yellow. Just tell us what those areas are.
The biggest broadcast in yellow is what we call the medium wave band, which is about 530 kilohertz to 1600 kilohertz, or half a megahertz to 1.5 megahertz, or about 600 meters to about 185 meters.
Okay, and that's medium wave.
That's the medium wave broadcast band.
And then you've got another broadcast band bang in the middle there, which is...
I'm trying to find where you're
88 to 108.
That's the VHF broadcast band, band 2 or FM, as people... It's wrongly called FM. That's the type of signal that's sent in that band.
Right.
But people call it FM. They'll talk about the local radio station being on such and such FM.
Okay, and obviously, so this chart defines who can use which bands,
That's right, yeah.
and it's drawn up by who? I mean,
Well, it's drawn up internationally by the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, say what bands can be used in what states.
All right. Now, on this chart, the very light cyan colour is the amateur band radio, which, when you look at this, there's not really a great deal of space.
No, we have very, very small allocations.
Right, right. And I mean, my sort of experience of radio was in the CB radio days in the 1980s when I was a teenager. I stuck an aerial on me mum's
Suppose you had
garage
a weird
roof
name for a handle as well.
Yes, I'm not going to say what my handle was. But yeah, I had great fun with that in the 1980s. I mean, it came over from the States. It was like from truckers, wasn't it?
It was a godsend at the time, yeah. I was interested in radio as a kid. I was about 13 when I first got interested in radio. And then in around about 1978, 79, the CB thing exploded.
So you were already well into ham radio before
I
that?
was very keen on radio well before that, yes.
Right.
It's about 10 years before that.
Right, right. And I mean, it stemmed from basically truckers in the States who were bored. They were travelling such large distances, they were just...
So they could keep in touch with each other.
Right. And I've got...
and obviously give out notice of speed traps and so on the roads.
Yeah. I mean, and they've developed an entire new language
Yes,
on this CB.
yeah, yeah.
And I'll just read out some of the terms. I mean, they've got the standard ones, which is 10-4, which means okay.
Yeah.
Don't know where that stems from.
A lot of these are used by the police as well.
Yeah.
As a confirmation.
Yeah, your 20 is your location. A meat wagon is a CB slang for an ambulance. The police are commonly referred to as the bears. So a bear's cave is a police station.
Right.
Or a bear taking pictures is a police with a speed gun. A bear with ears is a police officer listening to others on the CB. A disco tin is a police car with its lights on.
Makes you wonder if a bear behind means that you've got a policeman on your tail.
Yeah. I mean, in America, they have, well, in Britain, they had names for all of the different towns. So, I mean,
Well, I used to live in Stanley then, 1980, and it was Tool Town. Because of Stanley Tools.
Right, right. The concert was Steel Town.
Yeah.
And I like the name for, where is it? Chicago is known as the Mistake on the Lake.
All right, I didn't know that one.
And Area 51, of course, is called UFO Central. Yeah, some of them are... here's a good one. Someone using a mobile phone while driving is known as a four-wheel phone booth.
I'd probably call them something else.
Yeah, or here's a good one. A road pizza is an animal that has been run over and flattened on the pavement. So
nice, advertising. Yeah.
So, I mean, but ham radio, the CB radio is just one tiny group of frequencies on the
very small allocation. Yeah,
I'm at a band.
Half a megahertz, if you like.
Right. Now, on ham radio, obviously, do you have a language on ham radio? I mean, if I was to listen in, would I be able to understand everything that's been said, or?
We tend to use a thing called a Q code,
right,
which is known internationally by not only radio amateurs but professionals as well, where the QTH is a location.
Right. And you have each ham radio operator has a call sign.
Yes.
Can you explain that for us, George?
It's individual, it's totally unique, and it's a bit like a car registration number,
right,
although it applies to the person rather than the car. It's issued by governments in strict accordance with international laws to identify the country that the person's in.
So give us yours, George.
Well, mine's G4RNI.
Right. So what's the G?
Well, the G
then?
means England.
Right.
4 is the class of license, which used to be an A-class license. It's now called a full license.
Right.
And RNI are the 3 individual letters to identify the station.
Right.
So there'll be several hundred G4 stations, or several thousand.
Right.
Each with a different 3 letters at the end.
Right. And do you decide the RNI part, or is that?
No, well, it used to be that you were issued with a call sign, and if you wanted a particular one, as I did,
yeah,
you had to wait for that one to come along in alphabetical order.
Right.
The RNI bit I wanted was because of my original interest in radio, going back to 1971, when I heard of a pirate radio station, Radio North Sea International, RNI, being firebombed.
Right.
And that captured my imagination in radio big time. That was 1971,
right,
15th of May. And from there, I became fascinated by radio.
Right. Well, we'll talk about pirate radio in the second part, George. But before we do that, I just want to ask about the restrictions on what you can and can't talk about on ham radio, because I'm intrigued by this.
It's a bit of a mouthful. What it says in the license, I can't quote this word for word, but it's along the lines of remarks of a personal nature about which the licensee or the person with whom he is in contact have been directly concerned, or remarks about matters of technical investigations.
Right. So in other words, you're allowed to talk about trivial small talk or nerdy technical things.
A pie and it was beautiful. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to go back there tomorrow and get another one.
Right.
Or I can talk about
how to change the
piece of equipment I've been working on, or whatever, or a new aerial design or something like that.
Right.
But I can't say what I think, for instance, of the present government.
Right. Right. It's crazy.
The smile says it all.
Yeah. 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 You know, so what? I mean, why do you think that is in Georgia? Does it stem from the pirate radio days? When was that decision made?
That decision was made before Pussy was a kitten.
Right.
And it's down to radio amateurs being able to experiment with radio.
Right.
It's not primarily a method of communication. It's primarily a method of learning about radio and carrying out investigations.
Yes. Yes. Now, but what would happen if you started talking about politics and, well, say the kind of stuff we have on this show on ham radio?
Well, it does happen. People do talk about football, they talk about various football teams and the match that's been on and so on. We talk about things which concern us. And it's where it becomes a bit of a grey area what you can and cannot say. I definitely cannot go on and advertise a shop, for instance. I cannot go on the radio, talk to someone and recommend that they shop at a particular shop.
Right. But does somebody actually check up and listen in and police all of that?
We have lots of policemen on the airwaves, lots of, we call them licensed listeners, lots of other radio amateurs who would be listening in. And if you do something untoward, you'd probably get a friendly phone call or something saying, you shouldn't really be doing that.
Right.
Or in extreme circumstances, maybe be recorded and reported.
Right. So the issuing of the call sign and the license, you've got to pass an exam?
Yes.
Right. And
in my day, it was a City and Guilds exam. It was the radio amateurs exam.
Radio amateurs
and
exam.
It was a two-part exam.
Right.
Part about radio theory and so on, and part about the license conditions.
Right.
Before me, very shortly before me, it was a written exam where you had to write out and argue theories and so on paper, the way exams used to be.
Right.
I did what was called a ticky box exam. A lot of older licensees didn't approve of it, but that's the way it went. I couldn't change the exam that was there at the time. And now it's a three-part license, again, with a fairly basic exam, then a more involved one, then a more technical one to get the full license. So a three-stage license.
All right. And now, do you know how many license holders there are in the UK?
Oh, last count about 50 to 60,000.
50 to 60,000. And how many of them would you say regularly use ham radio? Because a lot of people they get into it and then they leave it behind a bit. They don't.
Well, I've done that myself. Yes, I've been heavily into it in the past. I used to do amateur television, send television pictures on particular bands that we're allowed to do it on. Not the TV bands. We can't use the same wavelengths or frequencies as broadcast stations or other users. We have specific frequencies we can use. I used to do television. Some people do satellite work. Some people do Morse code, which is a very, very basic form of communication, which gets through every time. Most reliable, CW, Morse code, continuous wave.
Right. Morse code.
Yeah.
Can you give us a bit of Morse code, George?
Da-da-dit, did-it-did-da, did-da-dit, da-dit, did-it is my call sign, G4RNI.
Excellent.
I can't sing it very high.
Right. So we've got two sets here, George. Just give us a broad outline of them.
Okay, the big one here, they're both fairly typical modern-day amateur radio sets. The big one will cover all of the shortwave bands from what we call top band, which is a bit of an anomaly because it's the lowest frequency we have for general use. There is another one a bit lower than that, but it's more of an experimental band. 1.8 megahertz up to 50 megahertz,
right,
which is getting into VHF.
Right.
It'll do various modes. It'll do the old AM or amplitude modulation. It'll do FM, not to be confused with the FM broadcast bands. It'll do side bands. It will do CW or Morse code, and it will do teleprinter.
Right. So how much are you talking for something like that?
If you're to buy a set like this new, you're probably talking in the region of £2,000.
Right. And would you be able to broadcast all over the world with that? I mean,
it depends on the frequency you use and the time of day. Some bands are open during the day and some at night. Some at different times of the sunspot cycle.
Right. So this is due to the fact that the radio waves will bounce off the ionosphere and off the sea as it's going around the globe. Is
yes, so
right?
they'll be caught in a tropospheric duct, which is a patch of warm, moist air above the sea.
So what's the furthest you've managed to talk to someone?
Space shuttle.
The space shuttle?
Yeah.
But would New Zealand not be further?
No, I wouldn't. It depends where they are.
Right. But you've reached New Zealand, am I right?
I've reached certainly Australia.
Australia?
Yeah, I've reached a lot of countries. I have a logbook at home. We used to have to keep a log of every time we operated, the band we were on, and the mode that we used, and who we spoke to.
Right.
Nobody really ever inspected it, but we had to do that.
Right. So when you spoke, so did you actually have two-way communication with the space shuttle?
Oh, yes.
Right.
It was very, very basic. It was my call sign, their call sign as a confirmation.
Right.
And they repeated it back, and then they'd move on to someone else, because when they have one of these amateur radio windows, if you like, it's, or the International Space Station, the ISS, it's very, very narrow. They obviously have lots of other things to do.
Yeah. But like float about.
Like float about, yeah, and eat beans.
Yeah. Okay. Right, well, we're going to go for a short break, George, but before the break, we're going to go over to the poet in the pub.
Kill those seals, they waste the fish. I want seal pups on my dish. I can't live on bread alone. I like whale meat off the bone. 'Cause if you try and live on salad, you'll only end up weak and pallid. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. Ostrich eggs and piles of veal is my idea of a meal. Don't tell me I can't eat deer. There's plenty of the round here. Or horse meat with tomato sauce is hors d'oeuvres with my main course. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. Squid and swordfish for my tea. I like things that look at me. Bread and dripping with hominy grits. The Durham puma on a spit. I've even eaten a desert vulture. I'm at odds with Western culture. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. If they're dead, it's not my fault. Fill me bowl and pass the salt. It's a bit better. Rob, can I have another one, please? I'm paying.
Welcome back on board the Starship. I'm talking with George Tuck about amateur radio communications, and we were just looking at these radio sets, George. Tell us about the little one there, because obviously it looks vastly different to the other two.
The small one will do basically the same job as the big one, but it has additional bands and additional facilities. For all it's in a smaller box, it will actually do more, if you like. Communicate two-way with satellites, and account for Doppler shift and so on, because as a satellite approaches or moves away, the frequency changes. A bit like an ambulance. When you hear the siren come towards you, then go away, the note changes. Well, the frequency of a radio signal changes in the same way.
The Doppler effect.
The Doppler effect.
So, so what advantage does having one of these big radio sets? Is it more powerful, or? The
receiver is mainly the difference. It has more facilities to adjust the receiver. Right. Because the old adage is, if you can't hear them, you can't work them. Right. And it has a better quality receiver than the smaller set. Right. And in my opinion. Obviously, probably a very important part is to get your transmitter or
transmitter receiver tuned correctly to your set, because from my understanding is that they have to be impedance matched so that more power gets out into the wave as opposed to being reflected back into the set. So it's a bit of a black art, transmitter design and that kind of thing. But it's all related to the number of wavelengths into the actual
an aerial needs to be resonant. It needs to be the right length to do the job. It's difficult to explain this to people who have little or no understanding of radio theory. But basically, the current where it enters an aerial needs to be at its maximum, and by the time the signal gets to the tip of the aerial, it needs to be at its minimum. Then it will all radiate. If it's not at its minimum by the time it gets to the end of the element rod, the aerial rod, it will then reflect back and create what's called a standing wave on the feeder, which you don't want.
Right.
So it's best, you need the aerial matched as far as possible to the set. If you can't get that exactly over certain bands, you have a thing called an ATU, an aerial tuning unit, or an aerial matching unit. These two sets have one built in to match, to cater for small differences.
Right. So does that switch in inductances or capacitances?
It switches inductances, capacitances.
Right.
That's easy for you to say.
Right. So the length. This is why you can usually spot the ham radio operator, because they generally have like a 13-foot pole outside.
Yeah, massive aerials outside. But then again, a lot of people have big aerials up for CB radio as well.
Yes. Yes, because I mean, I mentioned that I had a CB radio as a teenager, and I basically had my aerial on a biscuit tin in the bedroom.
It's probably not ideal, because the biscuit tin wouldn't be big enough. For it to be big enough to do the job of a ground plane is what you're looking at there. It would need to be roughly 18 foot across.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I then drilled a hole in the window, window frame, much to my mother's dislike, and then I had a ground plane on the garage roof. But she wasn't too happy about that. And I believe it's possible to actually reflect radio signals off the moon.
It is, yeah. A lot of radio hams do a thing called EME, E-M-E, which is Earth, Moon, Earth, and it's to send a signal up to the moon and bounce it back down. You normally do this on what's called a SCED, or a scheduled communication with another station, where you'll send a signal up to the moon, bounce it off the moon's surface, and back down to someone in another country.
Right, right. Fascinating. Okay, well, let's move on to pirate radio, because am I right in thinking that's how you first got into ham radio?
I first got into ham radio. I was interested in radio anyway. I wanted a portable radio. I think at the time I wanted to be able to listen to the police and so on, which was a bit naughty, but I wanted to do that. And the gas board for some strange reason. But I wanted to listen to
You are a nerd.
Yeah, I suppose so, yeah. And I was bought this portable radio for my birthday, 13th birthday. And one of the first things I heard, and I was trying to find Radio Luxembourg for pop music at night, because in the olden days, when everything was in black and white, and people didn't go out on an evening and things like that, it was difficult to get pop music at night. So I was trying to find Radio Luxembourg.
Yeah, because I remember they didn't play it sort of end to end, track after track, did they?
No, they were very limited.
That was a big revolution about this Radio Caroline. Hey, they're playing records all day long, isn't it?
Caroline's start was even before then.
Yeah.
You were limited by a thing called needle time. They could only play so many minutes of music in a day, and it had to be padded out with inane chat and Tony Blackburn's marvellous jokes.
So you're listening to this?
I was tuning about the radio this night, and I heard this Mayday call, which fascinated me. I think it would fascinate virtually anybody if they put on a radio and they heard a Mayday call that these people were on a ship and it was on fire, and it turned out to be RNI, Radio North Sea International.
And you've given me a recording of that Mayday call.
I have, yes.
Yes.
Mayday, 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 Mayday. This is an SOS call from Radio North Sea International, broadcasting from the radio ship Mebo 2, 4 miles from the coast of Scheveningen in Holland. We have an emergency on board, a fire in the engine room. A fire in the engine room. We do not know the extent of the damage. This is caused by a bomb thrown on board from a motorboat. SOS, SOS. This is a Mayday call. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We need help. We need help. We may have to abandon ship. We may have to abandon ship. We carry enough fuel on this ship to blow half the North Sea into the sky. We need help. We need help. SOS, SOS. This is the Mebo 2 off the coast of Scheveningen, Holland. 4 miles from the coast of Scheveningen, Holland.
This Mayday call, you're a teenager, you're listening to this Mayday call of this...
Listening to this Mayday call, it was Radio North Sea International, and I was just captured by that. There were these people out on a ship in the sea wanting to play pop music, and somebody bombed them.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand why at the time, but I was captured then. That radio became my hobby after that.
So the RNI ship, this was one of the pirate radio stations.
That was
I mean,
the Mebo
it's
2.
called pirate radio, so were they broadcasting illegally then, or...?
No. It
Right.
wasn't illegal to broadcast from outside territorial waters. What various countries did was made it illegal to come from the ship onto land or to supply the ship at sea. There were no broadcasting laws really applied to international waters. Certain states invoked laws from time to time which would forbid any of their citizens working on a ship at sea or airborne vessel or platform at sea in international waters and broadcasting. They'd say their citizens couldn't do it.
Right.
For instance, it would be illegal for someone to go out after August the 14th, 1967, to a pirate radio ship, broadcast, then come back on land. They could be arrested when they came back on land. But out at sea, very, very little could be done about them, until 1989, that is.
Right. The Mayday call that you heard, what was the reason for that Mayday call then?
R&I had a massively powerful transmitter on board. It could run, in theory, up to 100,000 watts or more. And it was anchored about 1 mile away from another radio station, Veronica, which had been on the air for about 10 or 11 years at that point, had a massive audience in Holland. It had a 10,000 watt transmitter. So along came R&I broadcasting anything over 50,000 watts, much more powerful signal, and taking away listeners from Veronica. And the theory is that the Veronica organization sanctioned the bombing of the RNI ship to put it off the air.
Right.
To cause enough damage just to put it off the air.
So these pirate radio stations, would they be making revenue from advertising then?
From advertising and promoting particular records, yes.
Right. Well, tell us about Radio Caroline, because that's probably the most known about pirate radio station. Radio Caroline began in 1964. Ronan O'Reilly, the founder of Radio Caroline, at the time I believe was trying to promote Georgie Fame. He wanted a Georgie Fame record played on the radio and nobody would play it. The BBC wouldn't play it, they'd only play established artists. Right. He went to Radio Luxembourg, he was virtually asked to leave the building. Yeah. And he said that he'd found the guy, he'd recorded the guy, produced the guy, he'd even started a record label, and now he'd have to start a radio station. And that was where Caroline came from. Okay. And in Ronan's words, the actual moment of decision to call the station Caroline, it was flying across to America, and across the center spread of the Washington Post was a picture of President Kennedy in the Oval Office with Caroline Kennedy playing under the desk. And the headline was something like, "The world waits for Caroline," and that's when he thought, that has to be the name.
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline!
Now, that ship was raided, am I right?
One of their ships later on, their original ship, they've had several ships over the years. The latest ship in the 1980s, that was raided 1989 by the British and Dutch authorities.
So what happened?
The ship was boarded, the Ross Revenge, by the British and Dutch authorities. The equipment was smashed, and the station was put off the air.
So what was the specific reason for that then? Were they broadcasting
I
stuff?
think that governments are very, very cagey about... I don't think they're bothered at all about somebody playing pop music on the radio, but they're bothered about having communication. Yeah. Powerful radio stations or other means that they can't control. A marine barrister said that if a Liberian ship was anchored alongside Caroline, it was loaded to the gunnels with crack cocaine, the Secretary of State can do nothing about the drug ship, but ignore that anybody likes to put Caroline off the air by whatever means necessary. And if anybody is injured or whatever during that raid, the persons carrying out the raid are immune from prosecution. Yeah. It's the most far-reaching piece of legislation.
So the government have got extremely tough draconian powers to seize any...
Unprecedented powers.
Right, right. And of course these powers were all brought in before the internet. which I guess makes a bit of a mockery of it all, really, now.
I can't remember the exact date of the internet, but it would certainly have been in its very, very infancy in 1980 and
I would say the internet, people started to use, I would say the mid-90s is when people started using browsers, you know. Prior to the mid-90s, there wasn't a great deal of, I mean, you know, your average nerd might have been, but, you know, it wasn't widely used.
You probably had people able to talk from one computer to another.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think
not go to the supermarket and buy their week's shopping.
I'm not sure if I'm right here, but I think even the internet was about possibly even the 70s. I could be wrong there. Might be, although TCP/IP I think was invented in the early 80s, which is the protocol that it uses.
Transmission control.
Yeah.
Can't get my mouth around
protocol.
Transmission control protocol internet.
So yeah, I mean, this is something which I mentioned at the beginning of the show, that if the government has the power to switch the internet off, which I've read it is seeking. Obama wants the power to be able to have an internet.
I've heard rumours to the same effect, yes.
Capability. Now, if that happened, let's say that happened, ham radio could come into its own then, and then would you think?
Yes and no, because it would be equally easy to just revoke all of the licenses in a country.
Right, right.
And then it makes transmission illegal.
Right, but I'm talking about maybe in some kind of a anarchic type scenario where there's maybe a civil war or something, and all that goes out the window, doesn't it?
Well, a lot of equipment was seized during the Second World War, but then again, governments do depend upon radio amateurs for communication, or the authorities do in various circumstances. One, I believe, was Lockerbie, where because the police in one, or the emergency services in one area were on different channels, if you like, to the emergency services in another area, they simply couldn't communicate. People who not sure where the Lockerbie thing happened, it's right on the border between Scotland and England. And the two different countries had different systems, so they couldn't talk to each other, and they actually called in radio amateurs to provide communication, a group called RayNet, the Radio Amateurs Network Emergency Team. They called them in to provide the communication that they couldn't provide.
Yes, yes. But if we just compare it to the internet again, the internet, you're completely reliant on this man-made backbone structure of cables and wires going around the world, and satellites, I guess, as well. But the difference with ham radio and radio in general is that you're not reliant on any real infrastructure. So you can't, no one can take that away from you. So if you've got your set and the power source, either a generator or a battery, you can communicate with someone.
Well, that's very true. In amateur radio, one of the big things is contests where people will go out and set up the gear in a field and communicate with other people on different bands around the world for a set period. They can get awards for it and get certificates for such things. Right. So part of the amateur radio thesis, if you like, is to be able to set up emergency communications at short notice.
Yeah. I've always said the nerd shall inherit the earth, George.
Does that mean it belongs to me?
Right, we're going to go for another short break now. Join us for more on Lockerbie after this. Welcome back on board the Starship. I'm talking with George Tuck, who is a ham radio operator, otherwise known as G4RNI. Now, we were talking about Radio Caroline, how one of their ships got raided, and you were just saying there that the Broadcasting Act came about in 1990.
It came about in 1990, yes. But the actual raid was 1989.
This Broadcasting Act gave the government powers to raid
a ship, even flying under the flag of a foreign state, to my understanding, and carry out whatever is necessary to close it down.
Right. So how did they manage to raid the ship before the legislation was in?
Who's going to contest the government? You've got sort of 4 or 5 DJs and a couple of transmitter engineers on a ship, and maybe a cook. Who's going to do anything about it?
Yeah.
Who's going to fight them? Yeah. Where would the money come from?
Good points. Now, you mentioned Lockerbie earlier, and we were talking about this when I visited your radio club a few months back. Now, many people may be aware that there is a conspiracy theory about Lockerbie. A lot of people don't believe Libya were involved and al-Megrahi was innocent, and they faked his cancer situation so that they could avoid a retrial, which was supposed to be taking place, I think, in 2009, and which was going to reveal that this guy was possibly innocent, so Libya weren't involved. So then that begs the question, well, who was involved? And I've got an email here from Neil Sanders, who's been on the show before. I asked his opinion on Lockerbie, and he sent me this email where he says that there is evidence that certain government personnel were warned in advance to cancel reservations on Pan Am 103. At least 2 warnings about a bomb on a US airliner came through the FAA at various agencies in Germany. Here's a partial list of US and South African officials who suddenly backed out of Flight 103 to New York. And it lists John McCarthy, US Ambassador, Stephen Green, Assistant Administrator, Office of Intelligence, DEA, Oliver Revel. So there's a whole list of people, and Bother's entire delegation of 22 people, including General Mallon, Defence Minister, and General Van Tonder, head of South African Secret Service. Now, also on the plane were some CIA agents who hadn't been warned, and they all died in the bombing. And in Neil's email, he actually lists the motive for killing these CIA agents. So there's a whole conspiracy about Lockerbie and whether it was done by the CIA or some other shady group. Now you suspect that you may have a connection to the Lockerbie conspiracy.
I don't know, but the call sign that I have, the RNI bit, because I requested that one.
G for RNI.
G for
you
RNI.
requested that. So this goes back to before...
1971 when I heard the ship,
Right.
the pirate radio station. And
So
I decided that if I ever got licensed as a radio amateur, that's the call sign that I wanted.
Right. So your call sign is named after this pirate radio station.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which was owned by a company called Mebo of Switzerland. Mebo being Meister and Bollier, the 2 owners of the company, which dealt in telecommunications. They were mega anoraks, if you like. They were dead keen on this pirate radio thing. And they set up RNI off the coast of Holland initially with transmitters on various bands. It was thought that in the early days that RNI, the rumour was that RNI was a spy ship for the Eastern Bloc. I'm not sure what you could spy upon from 4 miles out at sea, but there you go. What you could hear through the strength of the transmitters on the ship. I've no idea what you could hear through it. But that was the rumour anyway at the time. But after Lockerbie, after the bomb attack, it was found that there were fragments of a timing device which were allegedly manufactured by Mebo of Sweden. And that seemed to answer a question to me, because in the late 1980s, I had immense problems trying to operate my station. I was getting letters pushed through the door in a Home Office envelope, for instance, saying that my license could be revoked, that I was, in breach of my license conditions. I was causing massive interference to all manner of equipment, and I had to cease transmission.
So this was shortly before Lockerbie?
Shortly before Lockerbie, yes.
Right, and just tell us where you were located as well.
I was in Stanley. I was on top of a hill, probably about 700-800 feet above sea level.
Stanley in County Durham?
In County Durham, yes.
Right, which is not that far from the Scottish border.
No, if you like, I could see down to the Yorkshire Dales. I could see out to sea from there. And aerials, certainly the radio signals on VHF and UHF, would be able to see probably twice that distance. So I'd be able to see radio-wise about a 100-mile radius.
You, at this time before Lockerbie, you were getting all this hassle, and was there an MP?
It was incredible. Yes, there was an MP involved as well.
An MP involved who was trying to get you to stop broadcasting and get rid of your kit?
Yes.
Right. Can you name the MP?
I'd rather not.
Right. Okay. So there was an MP involved, you're getting all of this hassle, then Lockerbie happens, and then you've got...
Suddenly I had no problems anymore.
Right.
It was,
but at that time, you didn't make a connection with Lockerbie at that time?
No, absolutely not. It was only about a year ago I decided to see if Mebo still existed, so I could sort of send them a QSL card, a confirmation card, and say, look, I've got this call sign which used to belong to your radio station, and I put in Mebo into Google, and the first thing that came up was Lockerbie. Right. I couldn't tie it up at first until I read into it that this timing device was allegedly built by Mebo.
So you put 2 and 2 together and possibly made 5.
Possibly came out with 5, yeah.
You're not sure, but the possible, what you're saying is, what could be true is, let's say...
Some information got to somebody, and there was an amateur radio station which may be doing other things, untoward things, so let's get it off the air.
Right. So let's say Lockerbie was pre-planned by CIA, whoever, right? They were probably looking at various things, and someone perhaps knew about you, that you were named after this particular company who was also implicated, or RNI was owned by the company who was possibly involved in making the technology for the bomb.
For the timer.
For the timer, right? So they've perhaps linked you to that company because of your call sign.
Perhaps.
Right.
I don't know. It was just a theory that went through my head. And it answered a lot of questions because I wasn't allowed to have aerials or anything. And then once this all settled down, I was told I could have a mast in the garden and put up whatever I liked.
Right.
It just didn't seem to make sense at all.
So you think that there would be worries? So let's say you were involved with that company, and do you think they were worried that you were going to listen in on?
I just think that where I lived was in an ideal location to communicate with a receiver about 100 miles in any direction.
Right, which would have
certainly up to the Scottish borders,
right.
Easily up to the Scottish.
So you
borders.
were in listening distance. They were possibly worried that you had knowledge of this particular company. So
possibly, I don't know, but right. It was incredible at the time, the lengths that the local authority and the government, well, purporting to be the government, went to get me off the air.
Right, and you've still got a lot of that correspondence, I take it?
It'll be in a box in the loft.
Right, right. Now, I've featured on my show in the past, and people have emailed me about woodpecker signals, which are radio signals. Just tell us what you think they are, George, and where they come from and what they're for.
Again, in the 1980s, we found it very, very difficult to communicate on various HF or shortwave bands because of this racket that would appear and cover the entire band. It would kind of go da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da and just go on and on and on and on. When we were told it was a string of high-powered transmitters in the Eastern Bloc over the horizon radar.
Right. I mean, do you believe that? Do you believe that's what it is?
I don't know what it was, but I also heard rumours that if you recorded it and played it back on the air, that the woodpecker would shift in frequency.
Right. So it
would seem that it was sending out a pulse, then trying to detect what came back after each pulse.
I've heard things like the waves are being sent out in like a grid pattern, and that they can
where they cross.
Where they cross, they can activate certain lines and a node effectively, where they can then cause something to happen at that point, like I don't know, to heat something up, or to, I don't know, weather modification is another.
I've heard similar things, sort of, refer to like HARP as well. I've heard references about HARP to the same effect.
I mean, I've heard that very low frequency waves are possibly used in weather manipulation. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, it would certainly seem feasible. You pass an electric current through a wire, and yes, air will bend around it as it flows past.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how a microwave works as well, by heat and moisture.
Yeah. Okay, then, George, now you've got these sets here, and they're highly flexible. So in other words, you can set them at one end of the spectrum, and you can scan them. You can scan right through, can you? Or
well, to a large degree, yes.
Now, the law says that you're not supposed to listen in on basically 90-odd% of the bands.
Oh, yeah, I'm not allowed to listen to the vast majority of stuff that's in the air.
So the vast majority of stuff that's in the air, if it's not allocated as either a broadcast or a,
well, you're in the broadcast stations under your broadcast license.
Yeah.
And amateur radio, anybody can listen to it, but to communicate, you need the amateur radio license for that. It's a very small proportion of the...
So anyone can actually get one of these and listen to ham radio?
Anyone can get a shortwave set and listen to ham radio, yes, or a scanner and listen to it, yes.
Right, so but you need the license in order to send.
To communicate,
right.
Yes.
All right. Now, your old-fashioned radio set would have a big dial on it, and you would scan from one end of the spectrum to the other.
Yeah.
And I believe that in these sets, you have a little relay in there which switches off the transmitter when you get to a certain frequency that's broadcastable.
That's right. It will only transmit on bands we are allowed to transmit on.
So, for example, you get your tuner, and as you come to a band that you're allowed to broadcast on, it'll click the relay on.
Well, it's not broadcast, transmit. We use a fine definition between broadcast
Okay,
and communicate.
it switches the transmitter on so that you can then transmit over that band, and then when you go past it, it switches it off.
Switches it off again,
you,
yes.
You can hear the relay click in and out.
Yes, or the
Now-
software will switch it off. Yeah.
Or the software will switch.
It just
Now,
won't work outside of those
but
bands.
am I right in thinking it's very easy to just take the back off your set and remove that relay?
Some can be done with software, some can be done with removing a diode or a component on the board.
So it's quite a simple modification
Quite often, yes.
to be able to enable that set to broadcast pretty much on throughout a
To
lot of
transmit
this
anyway, yes.
spectrum,
Yes.
right? And I mean, do people do that, or you normally would you just be ostracised and off the air within?
I believe that people do that, yes. I believe that people use them outside of amateur bands.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, very, very similar equipment, looking in different clothes and different boxes, is built for marine radio.
Right.
Outside of the amateur bands, but it'll be very, very similar circuitry inside.
Right. So why would somebody want to transmit outside of the amateur bands?
Well, I suppose people like yourself who might be keen on CB would like a nice big flashy set and powerful set
Right.
to talk on the CB bands.
Right.
With sort of 10, 20 times the power you're allowed to run.
Right. Oh, so is the CB band isn't part of the amateur band?
No,
then?
it's a totally separate thing.
I see. So would it allow you to transmit with one of them on CB?
Yes.
Basically, right. Okay. And any other reasons why?
I suppose in extreme circumstances you could use them on a predetermined frequency to talk to someone elsewhere by prior arrangement and tell them anything you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And you could, I guess you could interfere with all of the broadcast stuff if you'd wanted to.
We could get close to some of the shortwave broadcast bands, but TV bands and the general broadcast bands, medium wave, the FM band as we call it, they're totally separate bands. We can go nowhere near them.
Right.
The equipment can't do it.
Right. Now, we'll mention digital radio because this is, I mean, it's something they've rolled out over the last, I don't know, 10 years or something, and it's become more popular, but I don't think
it's not taking off the way governments have hoped that it would take off.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people still have, you know, an FM radio in their car, for example. You know, they don't. I don't have I don't own a digital radio. The digital radio, because it's digital, can be more restrictive. Would you agree
well,
with
if we
that?
go back to how I got into radio by listening to this pirate radio station, I suppose theoretically it would be possible, just like your satellite box, where a particular company delivers programs and you can receive their programs, but not other programs.
Yeah. So in your old analog system, you've just got a range of frequencies.
You've got a range of
and
frequencies.
You
You can go
scan
anywhere you
your
like.
dial
Yeah.
and you can see. Basically, you can see everything.
Yes.
Whereas with digital, because
It
it's
could be restricted from manufacture to only receive
that
that which
yeah.
authorities wish you to receive.
Yeah, because you've basically got software in there which is making decisions for you as to you're allowed to
That's right.
to receive that or you're not allowed to receive it.
Well,
Time.
theoretically, it would be possible to build a receiver, a radio receiver, that if we went to war with Scotland again,
Yeah.
would only receive English broadcasts in England or
Yeah.
Scottish broadcasts in Scotland. And if you took it across the border, it wouldn't receive the broadcast there, wouldn't receive anything, because it hasn't been told to receive those broadcasts,
Yeah.
hasn't been programmed to.
So you can inhibit it in any sort of way you want to.
I can see no technical reason why it couldn't happen.
Anyone who wants to get interested in get some kit, George, or even maybe try out some kit, how does somebody get involved in ham radio? What's the first? Is there a website people
I
can
think
go
the
to?
first port of call would be the Radio Society of Great Britain site, rsgb.org, and have a look on there. There'll be various field days, various events in various towns at times of year where you can go along. If the Scouts have Jamboree days, we often put on displays there to show people what amateur radio is.
Right, right. And how long does it take to get through these exams? And what sort of level are the exams at? I mean, are they equivalent to a GCSE, or are they harder than that, or what?
They're more. It's more fine-tuned than fine-tuned. That's a good term, I suppose. Yeah, it's kind of honed towards a particular subject, which is communication by radio. The initial exam, for the initial license, it isn't too difficult. You need to have a bit of technical knowledge. You need to understand the basics of radio theory.
Yeah.
And as you get more into the hobby, you get more privileges. You're allowed to run more power, run on more frequencies, and so on. And the exams become more difficult.
Right, right.
But probably the final exam, the full license exam, is about equivalent to City and Guilds.
Right, right. Okay. And what's that mean, City and Guilds? Is that like an O level?
I'm out of my... I'm in a different time warp
Yeah,
here,
I'm in a
Richard.
different
City
time
and
warp
Guilds
as well.
used to be the thing that everybody did when you did an apprenticeship.
Yes.
You would get a City and Guilds certificate at the end of it.
Yeah.
If you became an electrician, you'd City and Guilds qualified.
Yeah. Okay.
Now
all
it's
right.
NVQ.
Okay, and George, thanks very much indeed for coming in. It's been very interesting learning about ham radio, although we've probably only just scratched the surface.
Small bit of it. Yeah.
All right, and as RNI used to say at the end of their programs, if you're still listening, please switch off your radio because you're wasting your battery. A couple of sets here, George, which we're going to discuss later in the show, ham radio sets. Now, just broadly, you know, ham radio enthusiasts have this sort of a nerdy reputation. Would you? I went along to your club actually, and I fitted in quite well there.
Yeah. No, they're an okay bunch of lads down there. They're a
Yeah,
good
they
bunch
are.
of lads, yeah. I think the confusion is that people, since the advent of CB radio, tend to regard the two as the same, but they're not. They're two totally different aspects of radio.
Right. I mean, I like to consider myself as a closet nerd. In other words, what that means is inside I'm a nerd, but I try not to outwardly show it so that people will listen to me.
Okay. Yeah, I think that people have this view of weird people sitting with smoking a pipe in a dusky little room, sort of talking to people about strange subjects and God knows what.
Yes.
I suppose some do that, yeah. But the difference really between CB and ham radio is CB is for two people to talk over a short distance, keep in touch with somebody, maybe driving a lorry, keep in touch with friends.
Yeah.
Anybody can buy a set, anybody can put up an aerial for it and do it. Amateur radio, or ham radio as it's more widely known, is a means by which you can self-train in radio communication. And that's the main purpose of the license, to learn about the theory and practice of radio communication.
Because there are limitations. Welcome on board the RichPlanet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall. On this week's show, a slight deviation from the usual subjects. There has been talk in the media of governments wanting the ability in an emergency to be able to switch off or kill internet communications. One alternative to internet communication is radio communication. And here to talk about it, I'd like to welcome on board the Starship ham radio operator George Tuck. Welcome, George.
Hello, Richard.
Your other name is G4RNI.
Well, that's the call sign I have on the license here.
Right.
Yeah.
And we got here eventually because we did plan to record this show some
I've been
months
going to
ago.
do it a number of times. I'm sorry I've had to let you down time after time, but it's the illness I have. It's called fibromyalgia, and sometimes I get out of bed and I just go straight back there because I'm just too ill, but we got here.
Okay. Now, we've got the things that you're allowed to discuss. We'll talk about
absolutely,
that.
Yes.
Talk about that later. Now, before we go into you know, the sets and everything, just want to talk about radio waves because there is an electromagnetic spectrum. Space allows waves to pass through it, which are called electromagnetic waves.
A nice little chart here, which you prepared earlier.
Well, before we go to that one, George, I've got another one here, which is the entire spectrum. That one that you've got there is the radio spectrum.
Yes.
Which this chart goes right the way through to visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. So just to point out that all of these waves, they're all actually...
They're all basically the same stuff.
They're all the same stuff. They're just operating at different frequencies.
Different wavelengths.
Different wavelengths.
People regard it, they understand wavelengths better than frequencies, I think.
Yes, yes.
Even though they don't understand wavelengths.
Yes. Well, the wavelength is inversely proportional to the frequency.
The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency.
The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency. And radio generally operates on the the longer wavelengths in the visible spectrum you would consider. So you've got right the way from wavelengths which are as long as a football pitch, which would be very low frequency.
Several hundred meters,
Yeah, up to your microwave end, where
we're talking in centimeters, millimeters.
Centimeters, millimeters, and that's the radio spectrum covers all of those wavelengths.
Used in what states?
All right. Now, on this chart, the very light cyan colour is the amateur band radio, which, when you look at this, there's not really a great deal of space.
No, we have very, very small allocations.
Right, right. And I mean, my sort of experience of radio was in the CB radio days in the 1980s when I was a teenager. I stuck an aerial on me mum's
Suppose you had
garage
a weird
roof.
name for a handle as well.
Yes. I'm not going to say what my handle was. But yeah, I had great fun with that in the 1980s. I mean, it came over from the States. It was like from truckers, wasn't it?
It was a godsend at the time, yeah. I was interested in radio as a kid. I was about 13 when I first got interested in radio. And then in around about 1978, 79, the CB thing exploded.
So you were already well into ham radio before
I
that?
was very keen on radio well before that, yes. It's about 10 years before that.
Right, right. And I mean, it stemmed from basically truckers in the States who were bored. They were travelling such large distances. They would just...
So they could keep in touch with each other.
Right. And I've got...
and obviously give out notice of speed traps and so on the roads.
Yeah. I mean, and they've developed an entire new language on this CB.
Yeah.
And I'll just read out some of the terms. I mean, they've got the standard ones, which is... So we've got a chart here. If we home in on this chart here, we'll just put this on the screen. This is the UK frequency allocation chart, and it's... I mean, you look at it, and it's quite... there's a lot of detail in there.
It looks very, very complicated.
Yeah, so that goes right from the low frequencies, 3 kilohertz, up to 300 gigahertz, and it's all split. We'll just point out some notable parts of it, George. You've got the broadcast in yellow. Just tell us what those areas are.
The biggest broadcast in yellow is what we call the medium wave band, which is about 530 kilohertz to 1600 kilohertz, or half a megahertz to 1.5 megahertz, or about 600 meters to about 185 meters.
Okay, and that's medium wave.
That's the medium wave broadcast band.
And then you've got another broadcast band bang in the middle there, which is...
I'm trying to find where you're
88 to 108.
that's the VHF broadcast band, band 2 or FM. As people, it's wrongly called FM. That's the type of signal that's sent in that band.
Right.
But people call it FM. They'll talk about the local radio station being on such and such FM.
Okay, and obviously, so this chart defines who can use which bands.
That's right, yeah.
And it's drawn up by who? I mean...
It's drawn up internationally by the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, say what bands can be